Ezekiel's story doesn't open quietly. It begins like a storm that refuses to wait. If you've ever had a moment where life hits you so hard that everything you knew suddenly feels small, that's the space where this prophet's journey starts. Not in comfort, not in celebration, but in exile. Far from home, far from the temple, far from everything Israel thought would last forever. And maybe that's why Ezekiel hits differently. His book doesn't just tell us what God said. It shows how God breaks into a broken place and lights it up from the inside out. Picture this: a young priest, around 30 years old, sitting near the Kebar River in Babylon. The air is heavy, not just with dust, but with disappointment. He trained his whole life to serve in God's temple. Then the temple was taken, his people were scattered, and the dream he carried from childhood suddenly had no ground left to stand on. He probably asked the same quiet questions we ask in our lowest moments. What now? Where do I belong? Does God still see me? And right there, in that heavy silence, the heavens crack open. Ezekiel describes what he saw with the intensity of someone who is trying to put lightning into words. He sees a storm rushing toward him, a whirlwind, glowing with fire, flashing with brightness, swirling with something he couldn't really explain but tried anyway. Out of that storm come 4 living creatures, each one strange and breathtaking. Human-like bodies, 4 faces, 4 wings, feet like polished bronze, and movements so swift they didn't turn as they moved. If you're imagining something wild, you're on the right track. Ezekiel wasn't trying to entertain anyone. He was trying to describe an encounter that shook his entire world. Above the creatures were wheels full of eyes. Wheels within wheels, moving in perfect coordination with the creatures. The whole picture is almost impossible to imagine without feeling a little overwhelmed. But that's the point. God isn't small. God isn't manageable. And God certainly isn't limited by the walls of Jerusalem's temple. Then, Ezekiel sees something above the throne-like expanse, something with the appearance of a man, yet glowing like fire from waist up and down, radiating like a rainbow shining through a storm. This was God revealing his glory to a man who felt like everything sacred had been taken away. As if saying, I'm still here. My glory has not gone anywhere, and neither have I left you. It's a moment we can relate to more than we think. Sometimes we expect God in the temple moments, the good days, the perfect plans, the steady routines. But Ezekiel shows us that God steps into our exile moments too, into the places we never wanted to be. And then God speaks, not softly, not vaguely, but with a calling Ezekiel probably never imagined carrying. Son of man, stand on your feet. I am sending you to a rebellious nation. Not a comforting assignment. Not an easy one. Ezekiel wasn't being sent to people eager to listen. He was being sent to people who had hardened their hearts, ignored warnings, and treated God like noise in the background. But here's the surprising part. God wasn't angry at Ezekiel. He wasn't frustrated with him. He wasn't even disappointed. Instead, he empowered him. God told him, do not be afraid of their words. Do not fear their looks. It's the kind of reassurance you only give to someone stepping into a tough crowd. Someone who will face rejection. Someone who will feel alone. And maybe you've felt that before too, stepping into a calling or responsibility where you know not everyone will understand you. Ezekiel gets it. He had to live it. God even hands him a scroll to eat, a strange, symbolic action, filled with warnings and judgments. And when Ezekiel eats it, he says it tasted sweet like honey. It's a reminder that even hard truths from God carry sweetness because they come with purpose. That sense of purpose soon becomes the heartbeat of Ezekiel's mission. God is rebuilding his people from the inside out, and Ezekiel becomes both witness and messenger. Then comes one of the most dramatic moments in the entire book. God's glory lifts from the temple in Jerusalem, the very place where his presence was supposed to dwell forever. For the people, losing the temple was like losing the center of their faith. But Ezekiel sees something deeper. God's glory wasn't trapped in a building. It didn't disappear. It moved. It followed his people into exile. It's powerful when you think about it. We often fear losing things, jobs, places, relationships, stability, thinking those things anchor us. But Ezekiel's vision shouts the truth. God goes where we go. His presence isn't limited to what we're used to. Ezekiel then enters what we might call the acting prophet stage. God has him demonstrate messages through dramatic actions, lying on one side for hundreds of days, shaving his head, drawing a miniature siege, packing his bags as if going into exile. It all feels strange, but it served one purpose: to wake people up. Because when people stop listening to words, God sometimes shows the message through actions. Then the narrative shifts. After the warnings and judgments, Ezekiel begins to see visions of hope. God promises to gather his scattered people, to shepherd them with care, and to give them a new heart and a new spirit. The famous passage comes, "I will remove your heart of stone and give you a heart of flesh." That promise hits deeply, because who hasn't felt their heart go hard at some point? Disappointment, betrayal, exhaustion. Life has a way of turning softness into stone. But God doesn't just repair the old heart. He gives a new one that feels again, one that breathes again, one that can love again. But nothing in Ezekiel compares to the vision in chapter 37, the Valley of Dry Bones. Imagine Ezekiel standing in a wide field filled with bones. Not just dead bodies, completely dried out bones. It's a picture of hopelessness at its highest level. And God asks Ezekiel a question that sounds almost unfair. "Son of man, can these bones live?" Ezekiel answers with a wisdom most of us learn the hard way. "Lord, you know." God then commands him to speak to the bones, to prophesy life over things that don't look like they can live again. Ezekiel obeys. And suddenly there's a rattling sound. Bones move toward each other. Tendons form. Flesh covers them. Breath enters them. And they rise, a vast army. It's one of the Bible's most gripping scenes, not just because it's dramatic, but because it reveals God's heart. He brings life where we see death. He rebuilds what we think can't be restored. He breathes into places that feel permanently empty. The dry bones represent Israel's despair, but they also represent ours. Those areas of life we've quietly given up on. And God whispers through this vision, "It's not over. I can bring life here too." As the book continues, Ezekiel receives visions of restoration, God bringing his people back home, cleansing them, renewing them, restoring their land, and re-establishing worship in a new and beautiful way. The final vision of the new temple is massive, detailed, and full of meaning. It represents a future where God's presence is fully restored among his people. A place where holiness and peace flow like a river, where God's glory fills everything again. And the very last line of the book gives us a name, one of the most comforting names for God in Scripture. The Lord is there. After all the warnings, heartbreak, exile, and loss, that's how the book ends. The Lord is there, not far, not silent, not missing, there. It's a truth Ezekiel learned beside a river in a foreign land. It's a truth that carried Israel through their darkest days. And it's a truth meant to settle in your heart too, especially in seasons when life doesn't look like what you hoped. If your world feels like exile, Ezekiel says God can meet you there. If your dreams feel like dry bones, God can breathe into them. If your heart feels heavy or hardened, he can renew it. If you've lost something important, his presence can fill the empty space. And if you feel forgotten, Ezekiel whispers a gentle reminder. You are not. God is closer than you think. Ezekiel's book may seem wild, full of visions and symbols that stretch the imagination. But beneath every scene is a God who refuses to give up on his people. A God who follows them into their lowest moments. A God who rebuilds what's broken. A God who returns glory to places where it once seemed gone forever. That is Ezekiel like you've never seen it before. Not just a book of visions, but a story of presence. A story of hope rising from places that look beyond repair. A story of a God who still speaks, still moves, and still restores. Ezekiel is still sitting near the Kebar River, trying to make sense of the vision he just witnessed. The whirlwind, the living creatures, the wheels full of eyes, the blazing throne. His mind must have been racing. Imagine seeing something so powerful that your entire idea of God gets stretched wider in a single moment. That's where he is. But God isn't done. Not even close. After that overwhelming encounter, God begins shaping Ezekiel into the kind of messenger Israel needs. Not a soft-spoken priest, not a gentle storyteller, but a watchman, someone who stands on the wall and sees danger before anyone else. Someone who warns people even when they don't want to hear it. God tells him, "I have made you a watchman for Israel." The words carry weight. A watchman doesn't sleep early. He doesn't relax when everyone else is comfortable. He stays awake when others are drifting. He carries responsibility on his shoulders, because if he stays silent when danger is near, lives can be lost. It's a tough calling. But Ezekiel accepts it because he knows God isn't just giving him a job, he's giving him purpose in a season where everything felt meaningless. Then God does something unusual. He tells Ezekiel that he will make him silent. Yes, silent. Ezekiel, the watchman, isn't allowed to speak unless God opens his mouth. It's as if God is saying, "Your words will carry weight because they will be mine, not yours." Maybe you've had moments like that too, times when you felt God pulling you back, quieting you, shaping you behind the scenes. Times when it felt like silence, but it was actually preparation. As Ezekiel listens, God begins showing him visions of what is happening in Jerusalem, hundreds of miles away. It's like God lifts Ezekiel out of Babylon and drops him right into the spiritual reality inside the temple. And what he sees breaks his heart. Inside the very place where God's glory once rested, Ezekiel sees idols. He sees leaders worshiping false gods. He sees people turning their backs to the temple and bowing to the sun. He sees hidden chambers filled with carvings and images that were never meant to be in God's house. It's more than disobedience, it's betrayal. Ezekiel watches as elders practice secret sins, thinking God doesn't see them. They whisper to each other, "The Lord has forsaken the land," as if God disappeared and left them to do whatever they wanted. But Ezekiel sees the truth. It wasn't God who abandoned them. It was they who abandoned God. This vision is heavy. It shows how far the people have drifted. Their hearts had turned away long before the exile happened. Sometimes destruction doesn't begin with an army. It begins with the quiet decay of the heart. God shows Ezekiel all this not to shame the people, but to reveal why judgment is coming. Because real love doesn't stay silent when someone you care about is walking toward a cliff. God's warnings aren't punishment. They're protection. In the middle of this vision, Ezekiel sees something heartbreaking. God's glory begins to move. Not in the way we saw before, when his glory appeared in Babylon, but in a way that signals sorrow. The shining presence that once hovered above the Ark of the Covenant lifts up and moves toward the threshold of the temple. It's like watching a home being emptied of its heart. The people didn't realize what it meant to lose God's presence. They thought the temple guaranteed safety. But a building cannot hold glory when the people reject the God who fills it. The glory leaving the temple is one of the saddest scenes in the Old Testament. It's not God abandoning his people. It's God letting them face the consequences of the choices they kept refusing to change. After the vision, God gives Ezekiel a symbolic message. He tells him to pack a bag, dig through a wall, and leave at night like a man escaping. It looks strange on the outside, but every movement is a prophecy. Ezekiel is acting out the exile, showing the people that their king, their leaders, their pride, all would be carried away because they refused to listen. Ezekiel becomes a walking message, a living sermon. Then God gives him another sign. He takes a razor and shaves Ezekiel's hair and beard, something priests almost never did. Then Ezekiel divides the hair into 3 parts. One part he burns. One part he strikes with a sword. One part he scatters to the wind. A small portion he tucks away. Each pile represents what will happen to the people. Some will die in the city. Some will fall by the sword. Some will be scattered. And a small remnant, just a few, will be kept safe. It's chilling. It's painful. But it's honest. God wasn't interested in sugarcoating reality. He wanted his people to understand the seriousness of turning away from him. Yet even in these warnings, something hopeful is wrapped inside: the remnant, a small group that God protects. A few strands Ezekiel hides in his robe, a promise hidden in judgment, because God always preserves what can bloom again. As Ezekiel receives these difficult messages, he also experiences moments that strengthen him. God's hand is often described as being on him, not pushing, not forcing, guiding. God doesn't just give Ezekiel tasks, he gives him strength to carry them. Then the tone shifts again. After scenes of sin and judgment, God begins revealing the future, a time when he will bring his people back home, a time when he will restore what was lost, a time when the land will be healed, fruitful, full of peace. But before that restoration comes a beautiful promise, one that sits right in the middle of the book like a heartbeat. I will give them one heart. I will put a new spirit within them. I will remove their heart of stone and give them a heart of flesh. These words must have touched Ezekiel deeply. Imagine hearing this while sitting in exile, surrounded by disappointment, loss, and uncertainty. God was saying, I can change what seems unchangeable. I can soften what seems hardened. I can renew what seems finished. We often think our hearts change through effort or time. But Ezekiel learns that true transformation comes from God's Spirit working in us. Then we come to a powerful moment. Ezekiel receives a vision of God's glory returning, not to Jerusalem yet, but to him. And when it arrives, Ezekiel falls on his face again. The intensity of God's presence always brought him to his knees, not because of fear, but because of awe. He hears instructions about how to speak to the people, how to guide them, and how to stay faithful even when the road is rough. God doesn't promise that his journey will be easy, but he promises that Ezekiel won't walk it alone. The next chapters describe judgments against nations around Israel. It might feel distant, but it shows something important. God sees injustice everywhere, not just in one place. He holds every nation accountable for cruelty, betrayal, and pride. Ezekiel speaks against Ammon, Moab, Edom, Philistia, Tyre, Egypt, each one receiving a message tailored to their actions. These chapters remind us that God's justice isn't limited by borders. He is Lord over all nations, not just one. But then something shifts again, a spark of hope, small but steady. God begins speaking about restoration. And one image stands out more than any: God as a shepherd. I myself will search for my sheep. I will rescue them from all the places where they were scattered. This isn't the image of a distant God. It's the picture of one who walks into the wilderness to bring his people back home. A God who gathers the broken, heals the wounded, strengthens the weak, and carries those who cannot walk on their own. This vision hits differently because Israel's leaders had failed them. But God says, I will be the shepherd you never had. Then comes a message for the future, a prophecy about David, a shepherd king God will raise up. Many scholars see this as pointing to Jesus, the good shepherd who fulfills every promise of restoration. But it doesn't stop there. God promises to make a covenant of peace, to bless the land, to remove fear, and to make his people secure again. It's a turning point. Judgment made way for renewal. Loss made way for hope. Exile made way for belonging. Then comes one of the most fascinating visions in Ezekiel, the battle against Gog of Magog. It sounds like something out of a dramatic movie. Nations rising against Israel, an overwhelming threat, and God stepping in with power that leaves no doubt who is in control. The point is clear. No matter how great the enemy seems, God's protection is greater. He defends his people not because they are perfect, but because he chooses to be faithful. But the highlight of Ezekiel's story, the moment where everything comes full circle, appears in the later chapters. Ezekiel sees a new temple, massive and radiant with holiness. He walks through measurements, gates, inner courts, outer courts, every detail precise and purposeful. Then something beautiful happens. He sees the glory of God returning. The same glory that left the old temple now fills the new one. Ezekiel falls again on his face, overwhelmed. The long season of exile, judgment, and sorrow finds its ending, God dwelling with his people again. The final vision describes a river flowing from the temple, clear, deep, life-giving. Everywhere the river goes, life springs up. Even the Dead Sea, a place where nothing grows, becomes fresh and full of life. Imagine that. God's presence turning dead places alive. Trees line the river, bearing fruit every month. Their leaves bring healing. Their roots never fail. It's a picture of restoration that goes beyond physical rebuilding. It's spiritual renewal. At the end of the book, Ezekiel hears the new name of the city. The Lord is there. Not was there. Not might be there. Not used to be there. But the Lord is there. It's the perfect ending. After all the visions, warnings, judgments, tears, and hope, God's presence is the final word. For Ezekiel, it means exile doesn't get the last say. For Israel, it means their story isn't finished. For us, it means no matter what season we're walking through, God is not distant. He's close. He's present. He's working. Even when we don't see it immediately, Ezekiel reminds us that God shows up in unexpected places, by rivers in Babylon, in valleys of dry bones, in shattered dreams, and in new beginnings. His presence doesn't depend on location, situation, or emotion. He is there, right where you are, right where you need him. And that truth carries more strength than any exile ever could. We begin with Ezekiel still living among the exiles in Babylon. The days are long, heavy, and slow. You can almost imagine him waking every morning with the same mixture of grief and curiosity. Grief for his people, curiosity for whatever God will show him next. Ezekiel never knows when the next vision will come. He never knows when God will speak. But he stays ready. That's something powerful about him. He lives in expectation. Even when life feels like it's stuck, Ezekiel knows God can break the silence at any moment. And maybe that's a lesson for us too. Faith isn't just obedience. It's staying open when life feels closed. One day, the elders of Israel come to visit him. They sit before him, likely hoping for comforting words or answers to questions they're afraid to ask. These elders represent the leadership, men who should have guided the nation, but often drifted with the crowd instead of standing firm. As they sit, waiting for words of hope, God speaks to Ezekiel. But the message is not what the elders expect. God begins reminding them of their history, not the pretty parts, but the honest ones. Their rebellion in Egypt, their stubbornness in the wilderness, their refusal to listen even when God rescued, protected, and provided. It's almost like God is saying, before you ask why you're in exile, remember how often you walked away from me. But the tone isn't angry, it's parental, like a father sitting his children down and saying, listen, you need to understand the whole story. God isn't interested in punishing for punishment's sake. He's revealing patterns, cycles of disobedience that brought them to this moment. Patterns that need to break. Then God says something striking. Even after all this, I acted for the sake of my name. In other words, even when you didn't stay faithful, I did. I protected you, guided you, and held you because my faithfulness isn't based on your behavior. It's based on my character. It's a reminder Ezekiel carries through every message. God's love is steady even when his people are not. After this heavy conversation, God takes Ezekiel into another symbolic action. He gives him a riddle, a parable involving 2 eagles and a vine. It sounds mysterious, but once decoded, the meaning becomes sharp. The first eagle represents Babylon, who took Israel's king and planted him in a new land. The vine represents Israel. For a while, the vine begins to grow. But instead of drawing strength from where it was planted, the vine reaches toward another eagle, Egypt, seeking help from the wrong place. The message hits hard. Israel kept looking for salvation from nations instead of from God. They trusted politics more than prayer, alliances more than obedience, appearances more than truth. It's something many of us can relate to. When we feel trapped or pressured, it's easy to lean on anything that promises relief, people, habits, distractions, rather than turning to God. Ezekiel's parable reminds us that shortcuts can't save us. Only God can. Then God shifts the tone again. Weep for the princes of Israel. These words introduce a lament, one of the saddest poems in the entire book. Ezekiel sings about leaders who once had potential but lost their way. Leaders who were strong like young lions but used their strength for harm. Leaders who were supposed to guide but instead led the people into deeper darkness. It's a raw moment. You feel Ezekiel's heart breaking. He isn't just a prophet delivering messages from a distance. He feels the pain of his nation. He grieves for what was lost. He mourns who they could have been. And maybe that's part of why God chose him. A hard message needs a soft heart. But then comes a vision that changes everything. God shows Ezekiel a pot, a large metal cooking pot, and compares Jerusalem to meat inside it. The people believed they were safe, protected inside their pot, untouchable. But God exposes the corruption boiling inside. Oppression, violence, greed, things hidden beneath the surface. It's a picture of what happens when sin simmers quietly until it poisons everything around it. But even this vision ends with a surprising twist. God says he will cleanse them, not just with fire of judgment, but with the fire of purification. He isn't destroying to end them. He's refining to renew them. And then comes one of the most heartbreaking moments in Ezekiel's personal life. God tells him that his wife, the delight of his eyes, will die suddenly. And Ezekiel is told not to publicly mourn her. Not because God is cruel, but because Ezekiel's life must become a symbol to the people. His silent grief will mirror the grief Israel will feel when the temple, the delight of their eyes, is destroyed. This moment is hard to read. Ezekiel's wife is taken, and he carries his grief quietly. The same man who spent chapters describing visions with passion now experiences a loss so deep that words can't reach it. Through this, we see Ezekiel not just as a prophet, but as a human, a husband, a man whose calling demanded everything. He obeys, even when it hurts. He trusts, even when his heart breaks. And somewhere in this pain, the people learn something important. If Ezekiel can endure heartbreak and still stand with God, maybe they can too. After his wife's death, a messenger arrives with news. Jerusalem has fallen. The temple is gone. Everything Ezekiel warned them about came true. But the fall of Jerusalem marks a shift. It's as if God says, now that the old is gone, I can begin the work of rebuilding. And with this, Ezekiel's messages turn from judgment to hope. God tells him about shepherds, false shepherds, leaders who fed themselves instead of feeding the people, leaders who abandoned the flock, leaders who scattered the sheep. Then God makes a promise that feels like a warm light breaking through a long night. I myself will search for my sheep. I will rescue them. I will bind up the injured. I will strengthen the weak. This is God stepping into the role of shepherd himself. Not sending a messenger this time. Not trusting flawed leaders, but personally guiding his people home. If you've ever felt lost, scattered, or forgotten, this chapter feels like a deep breath of relief. God sees every lonely place. He gathers those who feel scattered. He lifts those who have been pushed aside. He restores what others crushed. And then God promises to raise up one shepherd, a descendant of David, to lead his people in justice. Many readers see this as a prophecy pointing directly to Jesus, the good shepherd who gives his life for the sheep. As Ezekiel listens, God also reveals a coming covenant of peace, a time when his people will not just survive but flourish. The land will become fertile. The trees will bear fruit. The people will live in safety. They will no longer fear enemies or curses. It's a vision of a restored world, not just physically, but spiritually. And then we come to one of the most unforgettable chapters in the entire Bible, the Valley of Dry Bones. We touch this vision in Script 1, but in Script 3 we go deeper. Ezekiel is taken by the Spirit to a valley covered with bones. Dry, scattered, lifeless bones. God leads him through the valley, not around it. Step by step. Bone after bone. It's like God wants him to feel the hopelessness of it. Then God asks him a question. Son of man, can these bones live? It's a question loaded with layers. On the surface, the answer is no. In faith, the answer is yes. So Ezekiel gives the only answer that bridges both. Lord, you know. God tells him to prophesy over the bones, to speak life into what looks dead. Ezekiel obeys. And suddenly, there's a rattling. Bones move. Tendons form. Skin wraps around them. But they're still not alive. Not until God commands Ezekiel to call the breath. When he does, the breath, the spirit, fills them. And they rise, a vast army. This is more than a vision. It's a message for every heart that feels drained, defeated, or forgotten. God can bring life into places where hope dried out long ago. He can restore dreams. He can revive faith. He can rebuild what was scattered. The dry bones weren't just Israel's story. They're ours too. Ezekiel's next vision shows two sticks, one representing Judah, the other Israel. God tells him to join them into one. It's a sign. The divided nation will become one again. Unity will replace division. Peace will replace conflict. Then God speaks of cleansing his people, giving them a new identity, a new spirit, and new future. He says he will make an everlasting covenant with them, and his sanctuary will be among them forever. The message is clear. God doesn't just restore life. He restores belonging. Near the end of this section, Ezekiel receives one of the most dramatic prophecies in Scripture, the battle with Gog of Magog. It's mysterious, symbolic, and intense. A massive enemy comes against God's people. It looks impossible, but God steps in with overwhelming power. The point isn't fear. The point is reassurance. No matter how great the threat, God's protection is greater. No matter how dark the night, God's light is stronger. No matter who rises against his people, God's hand defends them. Ezekiel ends a series of visions with hope, so bright it almost feels like stepping into a new world. A world where God is near. A world where his presence is steady. A world where the broken things finally heal. Because the heart of Ezekiel's message is not exile, it's restoration. God disciplines, but he also gathers. He warns, but he also comforts. He judges, but he also heals. He tears down what is corrupt, but he rebuilds what is pure. Ezekiel discovers that even when everything around him collapses, God's faithfulness never does. And maybe that's the message we need just as much today. No matter how dry the bones, no matter how deep the valley, no matter how far the exile, God can restore. God can revive. God can rebuild. When you open the book of Ezekiel, it doesn't feel like any ordinary passage of Scripture. It hits you with something strange, almost overwhelming. Visions, symbols, fire, wheels, creatures, glory, and judgment. It's the kind of book people either avoid or rush through, thinking it's too complicated or too mysterious. But when you slow down, when you give your heart a moment to breathe inside its pages, you realize Ezekiel is not a book to fear. It's a book that speaks to the deepest parts of the human soul. Today, I want to take you into that world, not like a dry history lesson, not like a theological debate, but like someone sitting with you on the couch, telling you a story that has weight, feeling, and real meaning. Because Ezekiel isn't just about prophecy. It's about heartbreak. It's about hope. It's about a God who walks into the ruins of a broken nation and refuses to leave his people there. Let's begin with the man himself, Ezekiel. Try to imagine him not as a distant character from thousands of years ago, but as a real person. A young man with dreams, expectations, and a life plan he thought he understood. He was born into a priestly family. That meant he already knew what his future would look like. He would serve in the temple. He would be part of Israel's spiritual leadership. He would walk through the holy courts, offering sacrifices, helping people connect with God. It was a stable and honorable calling. But all of that was ripped away in an instant. When the Babylonian armies came, they destroyed more than buildings. They destroyed the rhythm of life, the identity of a nation, and the dreams of people like Ezekiel. At around 25 years old, he was taken captive and carried hundreds of miles from home. Imagine that, being kidnapped, relocated, and forced to begin a new life in a land that didn't know your God, didn't respect your traditions, and didn't share your values. 5 years later, he's sitting by the Kebar River. Instead of wearing priestly garments, he's probably dressed like any other exiled laborer. Instead of serving in the temple, he's surrounded by people grieving, struggling, trying to understand why everything they believed had fallen apart. There's disappointment in the air, confusion, silent questions, the kind you don't say out loud because you're afraid of the answers. And right there, in that moment of hopelessness, something unexpected happens. The heavens open, not gently, not softly, not with a quiet whisper. Ezekiel says the sky tore open, like a curtain pulled apart from the invisible world beyond. And God didn't come in the form we expect. No still small voice, no peaceful breeze, no gentle presence. Instead, Ezekiel sees glory. Pure, terrifying, overwhelming glory. For living creatures with faces that seem symbolic of all creation. Wheels within wheels, shining like burning metal, moving in perfect harmony. Lightning flashing, fire swirling, a throne of sapphire. And above it, someone seated. Someone whose presence radiates power, holiness, majesty. It's the kind of scene that makes your heart feel small, yet deeply awake. Most people read this and think, I don't get it. But look deeper. God was showing Ezekiel something he desperately needed. Even in exile, even in the darkest place, the presence of God is not limited, not trapped, not defeated. Israel lost their temple, but they didn't lose their God. And maybe that's the first message Ezekiel whispers to us today. Just because your world feels broken doesn't mean God has left. Sometimes, he reveals himself in the very place you think is the end. When Ezekiel sees this vision, it marks the beginning of a calling he never asked for. God tells him something strange. Son of man, I am sending you to a rebellious people. Imagine hearing that. Your nation is already shattered. And God says, they still won't listen to you. That's a heavy assignment. One that could break a person if they didn't have the strength to carry it. But God gives him strength, not the emotional kind, but the inward kind that settles into your bones. He tells him not to fear their faces, not to be intimidated by their stubborn hearts. Ezekiel is told his job is not to make people listen, but to speak the truth faithfully. It's a reminder we need today. So many of us want to be understood. We want people to take our advice, value our words, appreciate our efforts. But sometimes, God calls you to speak because it's right, not because it's easy, popular, or guaranteed to be accepted. Ezekiel's ministry was built on obedience, not applause. Then comes a moment that's both strange and symbolic. God hands Ezekiel a scroll, written front and back, filled with words of lament, mourning, and sorrow. And he tells him to eat it, to eat the message. It's an image that still resonates deeply. Before Ezekiel could deliver the message, it had to become part of him. He had to taste it, digest it, feel it. And surprisingly, Ezekiel says the scroll tasted sweet. Not because the message was pleasant, but because the word of God carries a sweetness that goes deeper than emotion. It's the sweetness of truth. This part always touches me. It's like God saying, before you speak for me, you must let my words live inside you. That's a lesson for all of us. Your faith grows stronger not when you memorize verses mechanically, but when you let Scripture shape your heart, your decisions, your reactions. As Ezekiel's story unfolds, God begins showing him visions of Israel's spiritual condition. These visions are intense, painful, almost like watching a medical scan revealing the hidden disease inside a patient. Ezekiel sees idolatry, corruption, pride, and a community that has drifted far from God. And honestly, that's not just ancient history. Every generation wrestles with drifting, slowly, quietly, without even noticing. A divided heart here, a compromised decision there, a small distraction that grows into something bigger. Ezekiel shows us what happens when people forget the one who saved them. But God doesn't expose the brokenness to shame his people. He exposes it to heal them. He shows Ezekiel the disease because he plans to bring restoration. That's something beautiful about God. He doesn't uncover the truth to condemn you. He reveals it to redeem you. One of the most powerful moments in Ezekiel's early chapters is when the glory of God begins to depart from the temple in Jerusalem. It's heartbreaking. The very presence that once filled the holy place slowly lifts, moves, and leaves. For Ezekiel, who grew up dreaming of serving in that temple, this must have been emotional, like watching the soul leave a body. But here's the twist. The same God who leaves the temple appears to Ezekiel in Babylon, proving that his presence is not confined to a building. His glory moves with his people. His power goes wherever he wills. His eyes see every land, every person, every situation. Sometimes what we think is the worst moment, something ending, something falling apart, turns out to be the beginning of God moving in a new way. Israel saw the temple's destruction as the end of their spiritual story. God saw it as the start of a deeper, more personal relationship with them. Then Ezekiel does something unusual, something people in exile surely found shocking. God tells him to act out prophetic messages through symbolic actions. He lies on his side for days, cooks food over a fire, packs his belongings like someone fleeing a burning house, cuts his hair, and divides it into parts. Each act is a living message from God. These symbolic actions weren't random. They were divine warnings wrapped in visual form. God was speaking through actions because words alone weren't enough. People needed to see the reality of what was coming. In a way, Ezekiel becomes a mirror, showing the people who they had become, but also showing them the hope that waited on the other side. Hope is a theme that grows brighter as the book continues. Because even though God shows Ezekiel the consequences of Israel's choices, he also shows him what restoration will look like. God promises to give his people a new heart and a new spirit, something no nation, no army, no king could offer them. And this is where the message becomes personal. How many times do we live with a heart that feels tired, worn out, or hardened by life? How many times do we struggle to change ourselves and fail? Ezekiel reminds us that transformation isn't something we create. It's something God gives. A new heart I will give you, and I will put my spirit within you. That's not just for ancient Israel. That's for every believer who knows what it feels like to wrestle with weakness, temptation, confusion, or discouragement. God doesn't just fix circumstances. He renews the heart. As we close today's script, I want you to hold onto one simple truth the book of Ezekiel teaches right from the beginning. God meets you in the places you never wanted to be. Ezekiel didn't want exile. He didn't want heartbreak. He didn't want a ministry filled with resistance. But right there, in the unfamiliar, uncomfortable places, God opened the heavens and revealed his glory. And maybe, just maybe, the same is true for you. Sometimes the hardest seasons become the places where God reveals himself most clearly. Sometimes the dreams that fall apart make room for the calling you never expected. Sometimes the exile becomes the doorway to a deeper experience of God. Ezekiel's book begins with visions that shake you, messages that confront you, and truth that demands your attention. But beneath all the intensity is a heartbeat of hope. A God who refuses to abandon his people. A God who moves even when everything else feels stuck. A God who sees you, knows you, and calls you, even when life looks nothing like what you planned. This is only the beginning. In the next scripts, we'll go deeper into the visions, the symbolic actions, the promises, and the breathtaking hope God gives through Ezekiel. But for now, let this message settle inside you. God brings glory into exile, light into darkness, hope into ruins, and he never stops pursuing his people. The most dramatic moment of this part of the book comes when Ezekiel sees a vision of God's glory departing from the temple. It's heartbreaking. The presence that once filled the holy place with light slowly lifts up and leaves. This wasn't the moment God abandoned his people. This was the moment God showed them what they had abandoned. Yet even in this moment of sorrow, there's a hidden hope, because the same God who left the temple appears in Babylon, right beside his people in exile. His glory isn't tied to a building. His presence moves with his people. His heart follows them into their darkest places. This is one of the most comforting truths Ezekiel teaches. God doesn't stay behind when your life falls apart. He walks into the ruins with you. He doesn't leave you in your exile. He meets you there. By the end of this section, Ezekiel is no longer just a priest without a temple. He's a voice, a sign, a watchman, a bridge between judgment and hope. And you start to realize something beautiful about his journey. God doesn't call the comfortable. He calls the faithful, and he shapes them in places they never wanted to be. Ezekiel teaches us that purpose isn't something you find when life is perfect. Purpose often rises from the ashes of what you lost. When you reach the middle chapters of Ezekiel, something shifts. The tone grows heavier, the visions become sharper, and the message begins to expose things people never wanted to face. It's like walking into a room where the lights suddenly turn on, and all the dust that hid in the corners becomes visible. This is where God takes Ezekiel into the secret heart of Jerusalem, not the city people talked about with nostalgia, but the city as it really was spiritually. This script is about that moment. The moment God pulled back the curtain and said, "Let me show you what you could never see on your own." And to understand this part, imagine the emotional journey Ezekiel was already on. He's in exile, far from home. The people around him keep clinging to one hopeful phrase: Jerusalem will not fall. Even though they're already captives, even though Babylon has already come once, many Israelites still believed the city would stand. They thought God would protect it because his temple was there. They assumed they were safe as long as the building stood. It was like a shield they believed could never crack. But God wanted Ezekiel and the people to understand the truth. It wasn't the temple building God cared about. It was the hearts of the people inside it. And their hearts had drifted far, far away. So one day, God lifts Ezekiel up in a vision and brings him right back to Jerusalem. Not physically, his body remained in Babylon, but spiritually, he was carried to the temple. And what he saw there broke him. The vision begins with something symbolic but powerful. A figure glowing like fire, from the waist down radiant like burning metal, stretching out a hand and lifting Ezekiel by the hair. It sounds intense, even alarming, but it's an image of urgency. God is saying, "You need to see this. Come with me." He takes Ezekiel to the north gate of the temple, a place meant for worship, prayer, reverence. But instead of worship, Ezekiel sees an idol, a massive, offensive image. Something so spiritually foul that God calls it the idol of jealousy. This idol stood there like a slap in God's face. Imagine a holy place built for the glory of God, now shared with something that mocked his presence. The elders didn't see it as rebellion. They saw it as normal, familiar, acceptable. That's the danger of slow spiritual drift. You stop noticing what should shock you. And God says to Ezekiel, "Do you see this? But I will show you even greater abominations." The message is clear. This is only the surface. He brings Ezekiel deeper inside. There's a small hole in the wall. God tells him to dig. So Ezekiel digs, pulling at the stone, breaking through. Behind that wall, there's a hidden door. And behind the door, everything changes. He walks into a dark room filled with the images of creeping things, unclean animals, idols covering every wall. And 70 elders, the spiritual leaders of the nation, are standing there with incense in their hands, worshiping these creatures. These were the men who were supposed to guide Israel. These were the men responsible for teaching truth. And they were bowing to darkness behind closed doors. One of them says, "The Lord does not see us. The Lord has forsaken the land." There it is, the belief that destroys faith. Not anger, not rebellion, but the quiet lie that God doesn't see. When people believe God isn't watching, they stop caring about how they live. Corruption grows in the shadows. Sin feels safe. Double lives become normal. And God shows all of this to Ezekiel, not to shock him, but to reveal the disease that had been destroying Israel from within. Then God says again, "You will see even greater abominations." He takes Ezekiel further. At another gate, he sees women weeping for a pagan god called Tammuz, a ritual connected to spiritual immorality and false hope. Then he goes deeper. Between the porch and the altar, the very center of temple worship, He sees 25 men bowing down to the sun, turning their backs toward the temple, their faces toward the east. The picture is clear. Their bodies were still in the temple, but their hearts were somewhere else. That's a warning for every believer today. You can kneel in a church, but if your heart bows to something else, success, relationships, money, fear, image, your worship is already facing another direction. Ezekiel watches this, and something heavy settles inside him. This isn't the Israel people talk about with tears in Babylon. This isn't the Jerusalem people are longing to return to. This is the real Jerusalem, broken, divided, spiritually sick. And then comes a difficult but necessary moment. The vision of judgment. God calls for 6 angelic beings to come, each with weapons. But one man among them carries something different, a writing tablet. God says to him, "Go through the city and mark the foreheads of all who grieve over the sins being committed." This is important. God always knows who belongs to him, not by religious performance, but by the state of their heart. The people who cried over sin, the ones who still honored God, the ones who refused to bow to idols. These were the ones marked for protection. Judgment was coming, but mercy was already prepared. And when the angel returns, he says, "I have done as you commanded." The message is clear. God sees every heart, every tear, every choice made in secret, every quiet moment of faithfulness when no one else is watching. He sees the ones who stay loyal even in a corrupted world. After this vision, Ezekiel sees something that must have felt like watching the soul of Jerusalem leave its body. The glory of God begins to rise from the temple. Not suddenly, slowly, moving from the inner sanctuary to the threshold, to the east gate, to the mountain outside the city. It's like watching someone walk away because their presence is no longer welcome. When Ezekiel saw this, it must have crushed him. He loved the temple. He grew up dreaming of serving in it. But now he watches God himself leaving. This is the truth God needed Ezekiel to see. Jerusalem wasn't going to fall because God abandoned them. Jerusalem was going to fall because they had abandoned him. Idolatry wasn't their problem. It was the symptom. The real sickness was this. They stopped believing God cared. They stopped believing he was enough. They stopped believing his presence mattered. And that is why the glory left. But now we reach one of the most beautiful turns in the entire book, the part that reveals God's heart. Because immediately after showing Ezekiel the corruption of Jerusalem, God begins showing him the future. A future not built on the old system. A future not reliant on the temple walls. A future not tied to the stubbornness of the people. God reveals something brand new. A promise. A restoration. A heart transplant. He says, "I will give them one heart. I will put a new spirit within them. I will remove their heart of stone and give them a heart of flesh." This is one of the most powerful moments in Scripture. Israel's biggest problem wasn't their enemies. It wasn't Babylon. It wasn't political defeat. Their biggest problem was their heart. A heart hardened by pride. A heart numbed by sin. A heart cold toward God. And God says, "You can't fix this, but I can." This isn't just theology. This is personal. Every person who has ever felt stuck in old habits, every believer who has struggled with inconsistency, every heart that has hardened because of pain, disappointment, or trauma, this promise is for them too. God is not in the business of polishing stone hearts. He replaces them. He doesn't remodel the old life. He gives a new one. And as Ezekiel hears this promise, hope begins to rise, slowly, gently, but surely. He now sees the full picture. Israel fell because their worship was empty, their hearts were divided, and their lives were double-sided. But God wasn't finished. Even judgment was part of his plan to rebuild them from the inside out. And here's the part that always touches me. God shows Ezekiel all of this not to crush him, but to prepare him for the message of hope he will later deliver. The message of valleys turning to armies, of dry bones rising, of a new temple filled with glory, of God living among his people again. After exile, destruction, and despair, God turns Ezekiel's vision toward hope, restoration, and renewal. He leads Ezekiel to see what the future could hold, a temple unlike any before, a place where God's presence will dwell fully among his people. The tone shifts from judgment to promise, from fear to awe, and from despair to expectation. Imagine Ezekiel being lifted by the Spirit once again. He is carried beyond the ruins of Jerusalem, past the exile, past the bones of the valley, into a vision of a city restored, a people redeemed, and a temple radiant with divine glory. This temple is not just a building. It is a symbol, a promise, and a living prophecy. God instructs Ezekiel to measure the temple with meticulous precision. Every wall, every courtyard, every gate must be accounted for. It is a vision of order, structure, and holiness, a stark contrast to the chaos Ezekiel has witnessed in Jerusalem. This temple will reflect God's character, just, precise, beautiful, and eternal. And then comes the most striking moment. Ezekiel sees the glory of God returning. Slowly, majestically, it enters the temple from the east gate. The radiance fills every corner, every room, every courtyard. The people who witness this will feel awe, reverence, and a profound sense of God's nearness. The glory moves as if alive, flowing and breathing. The temple becomes more than stone and timber. It becomes a sanctuary for the Spirit, a dwelling where heaven meets earth. Ezekiel realizes that God's presence is not tied to human effort or buildings. It is about hearts aligned with His will. The temple is a reflection of God's order, but it is also a call to purity, devotion, and obedience. God explains the details to Ezekiel. Water flows from the temple's threshold, growing into a river that brings life wherever it touches. Trees bloom along its banks, healing waters, abundant fruit, and renewed ecosystems. This is a vision of spiritual and physical restoration, a world redeemed through God's presence. The imagery is breathtaking. Every element carries meaning. The water symbolizes life-giving spirit, the trees represent restored hearts, and the temple itself represents God dwelling among His people in holiness and glory. Ezekiel is not just witnessing a future building. He is seeing God's ultimate plan for reconciliation, restoration, and eternal presence. Then God explains that the tribes of Israel will be reunited. Boundaries, once lost in exile, will be restored. The people will live in harmony, not under oppression, but under God's guidance and protection. Worship will be sincere, hearts devoted, and obedience will flow naturally from love, not fear. This vision challenges Ezekiel and us to understand the depth of God's mercy. Despite the rebellion, the corruption, the idolatry, and the exile, God's plan remains steadfast. He does not abandon His people. Instead, He prepares, restores, and renews. Ezekiel is moved emotionally. He has witnessed despair, destruction, and judgment, yet now he sees hope in its purest form. The people will be healed, the temple filled with glory, and the Spirit will dwell fully among them. It is a vision that transcends time, a promise that goes beyond Jerusalem to every heart willing to embrace God's presence. And there is a practical lesson here. Restoration requires alignment. God's presence returns when hearts are ready, when obedience is sincere, and when worship is genuine. The temple is majestic, yes, but it is meaningful because it reflects the transformed lives of God's people. Ezekiel also witnesses the distribution of responsibilities. Priests, Levites, and leaders are assigned roles not for power, but for service, ensuring the temple functions in holiness and order. This vision is not about hierarchy. It is about stewardship, devotion, and unity. Every person has a role in reflecting God's glory to the community. Next, God emphasizes the holiness of the temple. Nothing impure may enter. Justice must prevail, mercy must accompany discipline, and worship must come from a sincere heart. Ezekiel understands that God's glory is not superficial. It demands integrity, faithfulness, and obedience from His people. And then comes the most personal moment for Ezekiel. God promises that He will dwell among the people permanently. The vision is not distant or symbolic alone. It is relational. God desires intimacy, connection, and fellowship. He will be present in every heart that seeks him, not just in the temple's walls. This is a lesson for every generation. God's ultimate desire is not ritual or tradition, but relationship. His glory is not about impressing the world, but about transforming hearts. Restoration is not merely physical. It is spiritual, relational, and eternal. Ezekiel records every detail, every measurement, every promise, and every vision. The purpose is not just for historical record, but for the people to understand God's plan, to inspire hope, and to guide obedience. It is a blueprint of divine intention, a roadmap for redemption, and a vision of ultimate reconciliation. By the end of this vision, Ezekiel understands the fullness of God's plan. Judgment and exile were necessary, but they're not the end. Restoration, life, and glory await those who remain faithful. The Spirit moves, the glory returns, and the people are renewed. For viewers today, this vision reminds us that no matter the devastation we face, God's power and mercy are greater. Brokenness can be restored, despair can turn into hope, and God's presence can dwell fully in our lives when we align our hearts with His will. As we arrive at the final chapter of Ezekiel's extraordinary journey, the prophet's vision expands beyond judgment, exile, and even the new temple. God takes him further, into the eternal perspective where hope, restoration, and divine purpose converge. Ezekiel now understands that his role is not just to prophesy to his contemporaries, but to speak for generations. The exile may have crushed bodies, cities may fall, and despair may reign, but God's plan stretches far beyond immediate circumstances. The Spirit of God moves through time, shaping hearts and nations alike. Imagine Ezekiel standing on a high place, looking over the restored land of Israel. Streams flow abundantly, trees bloom along the riverbanks, and the temple glows with God's presence. The exiles have returned, families are rebuilt, and the people worship in sincerity, devotion, and unity. It is a vision of holistic restoration, spiritual, physical, and relational. God speaks to Ezekiel with a tone of both authority and intimacy. "Son of man," he says, "these are the words of hope. My Spirit will dwell among them. They will know me fully, and their hearts will be renewed. From death comes life, from exile comes home, and from despair comes hope." Ezekiel is reminded that prophecy is not just about foretelling events, but about preparing hearts. He records not only what will happen, but what could happen if hearts align with God's will. Each vision is a roadmap for faith, obedience, and transformation. The prophet is then shown a vision of the river flowing from the temple once more. It begins as a trickle, modest and unassuming, yet it grows as it moves away from the temple. Along its path, it brings life wherever it touches. Fish multiply, trees flourish, and barren lands become gardens. This river symbolizes the Spirit's work in the world, quiet at first, often unnoticed, yet unstoppable in its effect. Ezekiel also sees the tribes of Israel organized, serving, and worshiping in harmony. There is no conflict, no division, no fear, only a community united by God's Spirit. The vision is not just political or social, it is deeply spiritual. It shows the power of God's guidance, the blessing of obedience, and the fulfillment of His promises. Then God reveals the eternal dimension. The glory of His presence will not be limited to one temple, one nation, or one time. His Spirit will dwell wherever His people seek Him, wherever hearts are open, and wherever faith is sincere. The eternal vision transcends geography, culture, and human limitation. God's plan is infinite, and His presence is accessible to all who respond to His call. Ezekiel's role as a prophet reaches a new level of understanding. He sees that the work of God is continuous. Judgment and restoration are part of a cycle, but the ultimate goal is relational. God desires hearts that know Him, love Him, and reflect His glory. The prophet comprehends that human obedience, faith, and courage participate in this eternal vision. In one moment of the vision, Ezekiel witnesses a city filled with people from every nation, all worshiping God together. Language barriers, ethnic differences, and past conflicts are gone. The unity of purpose, devotion, and spirit is breathtaking. This shows the universality of God's plan. He is not confined by human division, and his spirit works to reconcile, unite, and restore humanity. Ezekiel reflects on his own journey. From the call by the Kebar River, through visions of living creatures, wheels, exile, judgment, and resurrection, to the new temple and flowing rivers, he sees the entire arc of God's plan. His life has been a vessel, his obedience a channel, and his courage a bridge connecting human experience with divine purpose. There is a deeply human lesson here. Life may bring challenges, confusion, and suffering. We may face exile in the form of broken relationships, loss, or isolation. We may witness destruction, injustice, or despair. Yet God's Spirit moves beyond what we see, orchestrating restoration, hope, and eternal purpose. Ezekiel's story reminds us that obedience, faith, and courage can participate in this divine work, even when we feel small, powerless, or overwhelmed. Then comes a final revelation. God's covenant with his people will endure. Hearts will be transformed, lives restored, and his glory will continue to dwell among them. The vision is one of fullness, completion, and eternal promise. Ezekiel understands that God's work does not end with human failure. It continues through generations, guided by his spirit and grounded in his glory. Ezekiel records these final visions with care, devotion, and clarity. Every measurement, every river, every tree, every act of worship is preserved for the people. It is a message that spans time, reaching beyond the prophet's generation to ours today, a message of hope, restoration, and divine presence. For viewers, the spiritual takeaway is profound. No matter the depth of despair, no matter the severity of exile, no matter the seeming finality of failure, God's plan continues. His spirit restores, his glory dwells, and his promises endure. Ezekiel's vision encourages faith in God's timing, courage in obedience, and hope in his ultimate plan. The final moments of the vision show the people living in harmony with the Spirit, the river flowing eternally, and the temple filled with radiant glory. It is a vision that embodies completion, fulfillment, and divine satisfaction. The cycle of judgment, exile, and restoration comes full circle, but with one overriding truth: God's Spirit is the source of all life, hope, and eternal joy. As the series closes, the message is clear and inspiring. Even in exile, God moves. Even in despair, God restores. Even in destruction, God promises hope. And through obedience, courage, and faith, we participate in his eternal plan. Ezekiel's journey, from the call at the river, through visions, prophecies, and symbolic acts, to the eternal promise of restoration, reminds us that God's glory is unstoppable, his spirit transformative, and his hope enduring.